we're going to measure rod bearing clearance. I already measured the rod bearing bore diameter with no bearing in it. So the bearing is in. If you're going to build a motor, go buy yourself a rod vise. You're going to need it. You can use plastic gauge, but I'm not particularly fond of plastic gauge. So the bearing's in. I'm going to torque the rod with the bearing in it to 50 foot-pounds because these are ARP rod bolts. Loosen it up, slide it through, take my dial bore gauge, go buy yourself a cheap dial bore gauge, learn to use it, get used to it. And I'm going to measure it at the front and the back of the bearing shell. And then I'm going to find my pen that I moved later. It's 2.5025. Put that back in. Loosen it a bit. I don't really care for rod splitters if I can avoid it because they press right in the bearing, which probably doesn't matter, but usually on rods like these you just take a little brass hammer, pull real hard, tap it a couple times, and they separate. Now all the rods are measured. Alright, everything's measured. It's time to actually begin assembling it. So I've got a comp cam, which I will put a link to in the description, and some Permatex Ultra Slick, and my very special cam installation tool, which is a long 3/8 bolt. So I'm just going to get the journals really well, and then before I put the lifters in, I'll do the lobes, which that will be shortly before startup. But typically I put the cam in first so I can get to it and support it. So I'll mess up the bearings as I put it in, then I'll do the crank, the timing set, then file the rings, the rods and pistons. This is just easier to do with the crank out. So just make sure you get the journals really well. Just be real careful putting it in. Well, I should put some grease on the cam gear, the distributor gear. I cleaned the cam before I put it in. There was actually a little bit of rust on the journals I had to clean up. And this was by no means my first choice of cam, but I had the option of 3 different cams, and this was the only one that was bigger than the cam in the last turbo stock bottom end engine, which ran out of steam a little bit earlier than I would have liked it to have. So went a little bit bigger. The lobe separation angle is a little closer than I wanted it to be. It's actually 107, which is a lot closer than I want it to be, but like I said, this was my only option given everything is in short supply. So a lot of grease on that for startup. And like I said a minute ago, I will put the comp cams lube on the lobes and the lifters. And I'm getting a phone call. Alright, we're going to get this seated. little more lube back here. Perfect. Pull that bolt out. I already put Loctite on the cam retaining bolts. I'll wipe some of that on the front of the cam. Got blue Loctite on these bolts. These are 9 to 12 foot-pounds. I usually torque them to 11. So I've got some Loctite on there, and then we'll be ready for the crank. Alright, my battery is about to die, but when you do a two-piece rear main seal, you need to make sure that you RTV it and stagger it. So it's RTV'd on the back side, it's staggered about 3/8 of an inch, and it's RTV'd where the cap is going to go. I'm actually going to miss putting the crankshaft in. The other thing to keep in mind is make sure the lip is in towards oil pressure, which it'll say in the instructions which direction to install the rear main seal, but make sure you do that right, because you have to take the motor basically apart to change it if it leaks. I'll let my camera charge for about 3 minutes, and it should be good. So, when you go to put a crankshaft in, you need to set the thrust bearing. Put the crank in. Obviously I missed that part. All I did was oil the bearings, put it in, hit the main caps down with a hammer. Hit the crankshaft back first to push the thrust bearing back. And then you're gonna wanna hit it forward to actually set it forward. You might wanna do it 2 or 3 times, because that's the direction thrust will be off the torque converter when the torque converter balloons. Then I like to torque these in steps. 100 foot-pounds for these are stock bolts. So I'll do 30, 60, and 100. And I'll start in the center. They're basically already that tight. Normally I would paint mark these, but I'm recording all of it, so, and I don't have much battery left. We'll go to 60 foot-pounds. And then 100, and then we'll check crankshaft end play to make sure it is appropriate. Alright, crank's torqued. I'm going to grab a dial indicator and check crankshaft end play before my battery. Crankshaft end play should be 4 to 8 thousandths. Pry the crank backwards and make sure you can get 0. We have 0 right there. Get a good spot to pry it forward and pry it forward. We're almost 5 thousandths, so we're right in the bottom of spec, but it'll work. That's how you check crankshaft end play.